Can air assaults be stopped? As Russia's attack on Ukraine enters its fourth week, the issue of air dominance reigns. NATO refuses to impose a no-fly zone, but are there other ways to help Ukrainians secure their airspace? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ukraine's appeal to close the skies. The Russian Air Force is one of the most powerful on the planet and far superior to Ukraine's. But 3 weeks after the offensive was launched, the Kremlin appears to be struggling to dominate Ukraine's airspace. Russian attack helicopters have been shot down, like this chopper, believed to be taken out by a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. This drone footage will likely be considered among the most iconic images of this conflict. But when Sukhoi fighters are shot out of the sky, it raises serious questions about Russian military tactics, specifically about why those planes were within reach of ground-launched portable missile systems, and whether the lack of precision-guided bombs has forced Russia to use so-called dumb bombs that have to be deployed from a far lower altitude. These are all factors to argue that a better-armed Ukraine might just be able to secure its own airspace. Still, President Zelensky has repeatedly made the case that his Western allies must help close the skies above Ukraine.
Back in the 1940s, you will remember the Berlin airlift. When that was installed, there were no bombs falling from the skies. But here and now, in my country, we are not able to create an airlift, as there are only Russian bombs and rockets falling from the sky. I implore you in the name of the elderly Ukrainians who survived World War II and survived the occupation. After 80 years, this has happened again, and I implore you. Every year, politicians repeat the words, "never again." And now we see that these words are worth nothing. A people in Europe is being destroyed. They are trying to destroy everything we hold dear.
Meanwhile, civilian structures continue being hit with airstrikes, including this theater in Mariupol. Hundreds of civilians, many children among them, had reportedly sought shelter there. Ukrainian authorities have accused Russia of deliberately targeting civilians, but the Kremlin denies all accusations. Now, on Wednesday, President Biden announced an additional $800 million in security assistance to Ukraine. That includes, of course, weapons systems to defend its skies.
This new package on its own is going to provide unprecedented assistance to Ukraine. It includes 800 anti-aircraft systems to make sure the Ukrainian military can continue to stop the planes and helicopters that have been attacking their people and to defend their Ukrainian airspace. And at the request of President Zelensky, we have identified and are helping Ukraine acquire additional longer-range anti-aircraft systems and the munitions for those systems. And this will include drones, which demonstrates our commitment to sending our most cutting-edge systems to Ukraine for its defense. And we're not doing this alone. Our allies and partners have stepped up to provide significant shipments of security assistance and will continue to help facilitate these deliveries as well.
So if Ukraine can't get that no-fly zone, will Kiev be able to secure its own skies given so much Western assistance? Or could a no-fly zone be somewhere in the cards, and with what consequences? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Kiev, Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, a nonprofit organization that aims to strengthen democratic institutions in post-Soviet countries. Paul Ingram, he's a senior research associate at Cambridge University. And finally, from Washington, D.C., is Jeffrey Stacey. He was a senior advisor to the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration. Thanks all so much for being with us. Paul, I'm going to pick up with you first because yesterday you stressed that in no way, obviously, do you support what Russia is doing, but you warned about the severe dangers of establishing a no-fly zone. And, by the way, the U.S. Congress more or less agrees with you in one of those rare instances where there is bipartisan consensus. So describe quickly why a Western-enforced no-fly zone could actually be a danger.
Well, let me begin by saying it would be largely ineffective because most of the damage being done by Russian forces are ground forces or forces that are operating out of Russia and Belarus and firing with standoff missiles. But more importantly, perhaps, if we were to be entering into a no-fly zone, it's not simply a case of declaring a no-fly zone and then saying to the Russians, if you fly, we'll shoot you down. It's also about NATO forces or whoever it is that's enforcing the no-fly zone having aircraft of a variety of types flying around Ukraine and looking not only for Russian aircraft, but also the facilities for shooting down friendly aircraft. So we're looking at radar, surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare capabilities that the Russians may have either in Ukraine or in Russia or in Belarus. So we need to be prepared to be firing on Russian assets, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia itself. And if that's not a declaration of war, then, I mean, it's very rare that states do declare war these days, but it is, in effect, a declaration of war. And if we do go to war with Russia, then there are severe consequences, potentially, not only in Ukraine, although if there was a full-scale war in Ukraine, we would be seeing casualties far greater than the estimated 15 to 30,000 that we see today. The casualties would be going to the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions.
Okay.
And that would not be good for Ukraine.
Let me ask Peter then if you think Ukrainians actually understand the potential implications of establishing a no-fly zone in that, as Paul was describing, it could take bad to worse.
Well, they indeed can. You know, we are aware that this is the kind of escalation that the Western countries, NATO, are really afraid of. And it's understandable. But let me just proffer a thought, something that is shared by a wide variety of experts here, politicians, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia itself, from among opposition leaders, and in the West as well, that we are already in World War III, folks. Just like the previous speaker said, you know, modern day countries nowadays do not declare war on other countries. You know, they sort of the wars sort of creep up on us, and so there's an argument to be made that, you know, we kind of entered this World War III situation starting in 2014 when Russia took over another country's sovereign chunk of territory in the first post-World War II land grab in European history. And now we're seeing the result of Western acquiescence, Western limp-wristedness, Western lack of resolve to not only, you know, punish Russia with sanctions, but to enforce these sanctions. So this is what we're seeing. So very briefly, Ukraine understands that. So Ukraine has requested the West to allow it to enforce its own no-fly zone, which means air defense systems, which means a system of you know, drones, as well as obviously fighter jets. That is the one big issue the West is sitting on for now, but I expect that that decision will come soon, as President Biden is facing a lot of pressure from Republicans and even folk from his own party.
Okay, Jeffrey, I can see you disagree. Let me come to you in just a second. I just want to clarify with Peter, though, if you then believe that Ukraine will be able to secure its own airspace with no Western-imposed no-fly zone.
Well, I am not a military expert. I would defer to others to say that. But once again, since our military, you know, leadership has requested that, that means that they will in fact benefit from it. And once again, judging by going by the record so far in the war, Ukraine having been armed with the best of some of the best of Western weaponry, including Turkish-made drones and anti-tank Javelin missiles, they've been able to hold off the world's second largest army. So that just tells you that, you know, Ukrainians know what they're doing, and they've been quite capable of using the military assistance that they're given.
Okay. Jeffrey, I want to come to you now. First, just let me lay some context for what I know about your analysis. I'm not sure really any analysis I've seen could have been as confident as yours. in Ukraine's and its allies' capacity here. You say Russia actually lost the economic war overnight, lost the information war in 10 days, and Ukraine, with help from its allies, will defeat Russia in less than a month. If that's the case, why are we hearing so many say, you know, the opposite is true, and that this conflict will continue, and even mention, as we heard from Peter there, of World War III?
Well, my colleagues are a bit hasty in these predictions of millions of lives lost and World War III. I mean, let's just start with some facts. We've got a situation where we should be starting with the focus on a war criminal in Moscow who's directing the Russians to pulverize Ukraine. Let's start there. Second, let's look at what actually is in front of us in terms of the military situation. Well, we're distracted by the almost red herrings of Russian artillery obliterating buildings around the eastern half of the country. What's happening militarily on the ground between the two armies of Russia and Ukraine is moving decisively in favor of Ukraine. A no-fly zone is manageable, especially if we do something like a smaller bite-sized humanitarian no-fly zone, whereupon the focus is on protecting civilian convoys coming out of the cities where war crimes are being committed on an hourly basis. That is entirely feasible. The only reason the West is essentially waiting on this major move is because of the fear of some sort of escalation that could lead to a nuclear exchange. But of course, mutual assured destruction, the doctrine from our old friend, the Cold War, is retained. There is no way that either side is going to use a nuclear weapon. So that means, as we've watched on multiple occasions in multiple theaters where Russian forces have been engaged in recent years, they will not mess with a NATO country. Nor should they.
Paul Ingram, I see you do not share that confidence, but I just want to ask Peter quickly, because he is on the ground in Ukraine. Are you convinced at all, having heard Jeffrey's argument?
Yes, largely so. I believe that, you know, the military equation is definitely not in Russia's favor. And that explains Putin's desperation, the fact that he's been resorting now to shelling civilians in civilian population centers, sort of following the Grozny and Aleppo scenario. But having said that, I would caution against resting, assured that all will be well, simply because, of what we're seeing. And once again, Vladimir Putin has threatened nuclear. He has blackmailed the world with a nuclear weapon for quite some time now. And that is the scariest scenario that even sane political analysts and military analysts are currently considering.
Okay, Paul, I imagine the case for you is that you don't think Putin sees the doctrine of mutual destruction as a deterrent here necessarily, via using nuclear power or nuclear weapons.
It's not just me. Yes, it's not just me that's worried about that. US intelligence has actually stated quite boldly that they have no confidence that Putin would not use a nuclear weapon in this context. So I think we have to take this threat seriously. I'm not saying that he would, but if the war does go against him in the way that my two colleagues are suggesting, then I think the risks of nuclear use cannot be just discounted and declared to be zero. I mean, we're on the one hand told that this is a war criminal who's lost his mind, and on the other hand, we're being told that Putin is never going to use nuclear weapons. I just don't see this being the confidence that we can have. And let me reinforce this point. I stand by the Ukrainian civilians and those that have died, and it's terrible and horrific. And there's 15 to 30,000 of them. In Tigray, in the last 16 months, we've had 500,000 people die directly as a result of the killings by the Ethiopian government. But we don't get calls for no-fly zones there. So we have to actually see this in its broader context. and trying to find ways as quickly as possible, not to escalate this crisis, but to de-escalate it, to actually place greater faith than my colleagues are doing in the talks that are currently ongoing, and in which both sides are suggesting that there are potential breakthroughs. Talks of no-fly zones do not help the talks going on right now.
Okay. Jeffrey, I'll let you respond, and please tell me if you don't believe that Putin is more reckless than his Soviet predecessors.
Putin is a fairly rational actor. He has, in all his escapades abroad using his military in recent years, he does use a cost-benefit calculus. He does do what he perceives to be in his country's interest. Using a tactical nuclear weapon is not in his own personal, nor his government, nor his country's interest. He will not do so. It doesn't mean there's a zero chance. I don't appreciate words being put in my mouth from the far left, but let's be very clear. He's been warned explicitly by the government where he sits, my colleague, by the government in the city where I am, and others, that if he takes that step, he will lose his life and everything that he holds dear. What is far more serious is the potential for an escalation from here that continues to lead to thousands of lives being lost, which my Cambridge colleague does not seem to be at all worried about. This knee-jerk anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism is something that should be entirely discarded in this hour of peril. What we should focus on is whatever will get Russia to back off, sign a ceasefire, begin to withdraw, and then start paying for the rebuilding of Ukraine that it has violated all the Geneva Conventions to so brazenly and wantonly attack in the first place.
Okay, just quickly, Paul, I know you are very disturbed by the thousands and thousands of people who've been affected by this war. I understand that from your perspective. Paul was making the point that he fears how much worse it could get if this is escalated. Not to say he doesn't care about those who have already suffered. But I need to ask Peter very quickly, do you take any comfort in hearing Jeffrey argue that Putin is a rational actor?
Well, I'm not sure that Jeffrey is arguing necessarily that, because no one knows. I would lean towards the interpretation that Vladimir Putin has increasingly existed in the world of his own making, especially after 2 years of essentially sitting in a bunker during COVID and having finally emerged. And you're seeing these ridiculous scenes of him sitting in front of his own officials at a 10-meter distance, these incredibly long tables, etc. It shows you that the guy is clearly paranoid. And so that is another, argument to be made that he may indeed resort to some kind of a limited nuclear strike. But once again, that does not disqualify our other panelists' position that only credible, muscular show of force will dissuade him from further iniquities in Ukraine and in the world at large.
Okay. Paul, let me come back to you, because standing where you stand... okay, go ahead. I see you have a response to what you've heard. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that that this sort of escalation talk is deeply irresponsible. We are nowhere near right now in terms of scale World War III, and to describe this as World War III, as Ukrainian leaderships have, is deeply irresponsible and is clearly designed to pull us in. I think all your viewers need to be quite aware of what is at stake here. Now, I am not a left-wing person. I am not some crazy anti-American person, and playing the man, not the ball, is deeply irresponsible in TV programs like this. I am from Cambridge University. I am from the Center for the Study of Existential Risk.
Why don't we talk about
seriously concerned. I'm seriously concerned about the fact that we could go to a war that ends in nuclear exchange and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people.
What we
and that
have
is no
already.
exaggeration. And if you, it is not. 100 million people is a lot of people, and 15,000 is a lot of people, but it is of a completely different scale. And if you are not able to see that, your viewers will.
Are you able to
this is not
predict
something
exactly how
about
many
being safe
casualties there will
here in
be?
Cambridge. It's about trying to, and don't speak over me because I do not speak over you when you attack me. I think this is beyond credible to be talking about escalating a war that currently could easily fall into World War III when it isn't at the moment. We need to be cool in our heads, and we need to be analysing this with clarity, and that is not what we're getting today.
Okay.
We are getting emotional to people to intervene.
Yeah, I mean, it does naturally become emotional because this is a deeply disturbing subject that we've had to address now for the last 3 weeks. I don't think anyone thought it would get to this point, and as we've heard over and over, I don't think anybody can get into Putin's head to be able to say exactly what is supposed to happen now, how much worse this may or may not get. But still, we try to learn from history. And we're constantly hearing these comparisons, even through Peter and many Ukrainians I've spoken to World War II. Paul and Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you then, I mean, how much longer, if this is indeed a repetition of very dangerous history, how much longer can the world hold off then on getting involved? You know, the mayor of Mykolaiv that we spoke to the other day, he said, ignore this at your peril, just as Hitler was ignored when he invaded Sudetenland and Poland. I mean, Jeffrey, do you see those parallels there, or is there's just, I think you said we can't make those comparisons today?
We're in entirely new territory here, and my colleagues are not able, nor am I, to use a crystal ball here. But what is most deeply irresponsible is not to be holding Vladimir Putin to account for what he's engaged in here. So let me go back to and answer your question about, I have not said, and I do not predict that the war will be over in 3 weeks. What we're talking about is a defense term of art and precision at the same time of a military culmination, which means essentially when the ability of an attacking power begins to essentially be stymied militarily on the battlefield. That's what we're talking about. Now, there are myriad reasons why Russia is in trouble right now, which is why Vladimir Putin yesterday essentially sounded like my friend in Cambridge there, getting all hysterical in a situation where he is menacingly threatening more evil, terror, and essentially raining military hell on innocent civilians in Ukraine.
Okay.
That is what needs to be stopped.
Okay.
That can be stopped. It is largely being done so actually with our help. The West is already involved, very closely involved, and will continue to be. And the momentum is building for a halfway no-fly zone that protects humanitarian corridors. That is a life-saving measure. It does not add to casualties. Let's be precise where precision is due.
Fair enough.
And entirely responsible.
Down to our last few minutes. I want Peter and Paul both to have a chance to respond. Paul Ingram, go ahead.
Yeah, so we are nowhere near any halfway no-fly zone. Supplying the Ukrainians with anti-aircraft equipment, Stinger missiles and the like that is involved in this package that was announced by the White House this week of $800 million, which is a huge amount of military kit that incidentally will probably not arrive in Ukraine, if it ever does, within the next few weeks. So this is a commitment to an extended conflict, and no, it isn't. But a no-fly zone is a very specific proposal, and involves NATO aircraft and other assets firing and taking down Russian aircraft if they fly in the area. Now that is not what is being proposed. That is not what is being executed right now, and that's what we're talking about, is a no-fly zone. This is not a halfway no-fly zone.
Okay.
And I think we need to be precise in that terminology.
Let me finish with Peter then. I mean, having heard what you've heard, these kind of different perspectives now, do you feel the dynamics, you being in Ukraine, are understood by the world outside?
I think increasingly so. And once again, I think, a lot of it has been due to the Ukrainians' ability to mobilize the informational kind of message, the information. It's a war that's being prosecuted both on the military level and informational level, and Ukrainians have done an incredible job. President Zelensky takes all of the credit for his emotional appeals to Bundestag today, to the Congress yesterday, to the British Parliament a few days ago. So the message is getting through. And once again, let me just make clear, Ukrainians are clear-headed about this. For example, I also want to be seen as being careful about not warmongering excessively. I do understand the risks of a measure such as enforcing a no-fly zone. What I would say is that the way and the logic of this escalation so far, and seeing Vladimir Putin get totally unhinged and bomb cities, including cities of very personal, connection with me, cities where I have grown up, where I grew up in. The way it's going, Europe may feel, NATO may feel that it's up against the wall and may have no other choice but to enforce some semblance, some maybe partial no-fly zone, even though I know that may not be what Ukrainians expect and not work as Ukrainians expect it to work.
Okay.
But at the very least, to reconcile the two positions, I would say that the West should continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons necessary to assure its own security.
Right. They do seem to be on their way. Okay, Peter Zalmayev, Paul Ingram, and Jeffrey Stacey, thanks all so much for being with us, and of course our viewers as well. Remember to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll be back with another edition of the Newsmakers tomorrow. Thanks for being here.